Stop. Before the headlines blur into background noise, understand this clearly. What unfolded last night was not disorder, not unrest, not isolated incidents. It was a systems failure playing out in real time, under streetlights, in front of cameras, and beneath the calm language of official statements that no longer match lived reality. By 8 o'clock, tension was already baked into the evening. By 9, control had fractured. And by the time most people reached for the remote, the streets had already told the story. Authorities would spend the rest of the night trying to soften. What follows is not commentary. It is a reconstruction of how an ordinary evening tipped into something far more serious, and why it matters now. By early evening, the numbers alone were already doing the shouting. Knife-related violence had reached a level where statistics stopped sounding abstract and started feeling personal. When incidents occur at a pace that resets the clock every few minutes, it stops being a trend and becomes an atmosphere. The streets carry it, public transport carries it. Parents feel it when phones stay unanswered for a few minutes too long. Officials insisted the situation was manageable, pointing to selective year-on-year comparisons, but the public experience did not match the spreadsheet narrative. Emergency services were already stretched. Hospitals had already adapted trauma protocols once reserved for rare events. What changed last night was not the existence of violence, but its visibility. The sense that it was no longer contained to postcodes people were told not to worry about. As dusk fell, frustration had fermented into something volatile. This was not spontaneous anger, it was accumulated. Years of hearing that things were improving while behaviors worsened have a corrosive effect. People stop believing reassurances, they stop reporting, they stop waiting. When violence becomes routine, patience becomes the first casualty. That context matters, because without it, the events that followed looked sudden. They were not. They were delayed. The mood in public spaces felt brittle, not fearful, but taut, like a room where everyone knows an argument is coming, but no one wants to start it. The claim that the public was overreacting failed immediately, because reaction implies surprise. There was none. There was recognition, the sense that something long predicted had finally arrived, right on schedule. When commentators later asked why tempers flared so quickly, the answer was simple. They had been flaring quietly for years. Last night merely removed the lid. And just as that pressure reached its limit, the streets provided the trigger that would push events past containment. Shortly after 8, the demonstrations shifted tone. What began as vocal frustration hardened into confrontation, and the timeline tightened rapidly. Police lines were deployed with restraint, operating under guidance that prioritized optics over dominance. That choice shaped everything that followed. Once the crowd sensed hesitation, momentum transferred. Fireworks ceased being symbolic and became tactical, aimed directly at officers rather than skyward. Vehicles were repositioned defensively, then overwhelmed. Orders to hold ground collided with conditions that made holding ground impossible. The retreat that followed was not a collapse of courage, but of mandate. Officers are acutely aware of the legal scrutiny awaiting every decision. The calculation is no longer simply about safety in the moment, but consequences months later. That hesitation was visible, and visibility matters. When authority hesitates publicly, it signals permission privately. The crowd responded accordingly. As clashes spread, emergency response became reactive rather than preventative. Each new deployment addressed the previous incident, not the next. This lag created pockets of autonomy where no one was fully in control. By the time reinforcements arrived, damage was already done. Injuries mounted on both sides, but the narrative immediately narrowed to optics rather than causes. Language softened even as events intensified. Words like contained were used while footage showed otherwise. What escalated the situation further was the insistence that everything remained under control. Statements aimed at reassurance had the opposite effect, because people were watching the same images. Discrepancy between language and reality fuels distrust faster than silence ever could. Once that gap opens, authority bleeds credibility. By 9, it was no longer about protest, it was about territory, symbolism, and the unspoken question of who actually held the streets. That question lingered unanswered longer than it should have, and in that pause, confidence drained away from those tasked with maintaining order. What followed next was not chaos, it was an adaptation.
As uniformed presence thinned, informal control filled the space. Groups moved with intent, not aimlessly. Bottles were thrown with purpose. Routes were tested. Boundaries were probed. This was not mindless destruction, it was opportunistic assertion. When police vans were surrounded and destroyed, it sent a message that traveled faster than any official update. The street had learned something important. Resistance would not be met with decisive force. Hospitals absorbed the consequences almost immediately. Admissions reflected the reality of blade-related injuries rather than crowd scuffles. Medical staff dealt with wounds that suggested an escalation, not an accident. Meanwhile, public communication focused on labels, extremism, provocation, disinformation, anything except the obvious link between rising violent crime and public rage. The attempt to categorize the unrest distracted from its root. People were no longer asking for reassurance, they were seeking protection, but they were not receiving a convincing answer. When that happens, behavior changes, trust erodes, compliance fades. The idea that the state will intervene effectively becomes theoretical rather than practical. This erosion did not occur overnight. It was built through policy decisions that prioritized appearance over impact. The public understands this instinctively. When sentences feel symbolic, deterrence evaporates. When bans target objects rather than behavior, workarounds appear instantly. Last night demonstrated that clearly. Weapons were not absent, they were simply renamed. Availability adapted faster than regulation. At the same time, the justice system's capacity crisis hovered in the background, shaping outcomes invisibly. With custodial space exhausted, consequences softened. That fact is widely understood on the street, even if rarely acknowledged officially. When offenders believe consequences are negotiable, behavior follows. By the time the fires were extinguished, something more permanent had ignited, the belief that order is conditional and protection uncertain. That belief does not fade with daylight. The strain on the custodial system sits at the center of this story, whether acknowledged or not. When facilities operate beyond capacity, policy shifts from deterrence to distribution. Early release becomes arithmetic rather than judgment. Thousands exit custody earlier than anticipated, not because risk has diminished, but because space has vanished. That reality reshapes behavior across the board. Police know it, offenders know it, victims feel it. This creates a feedback loop. Arrests feel futile, sentences feel temporary, reporting drops, public patience thins. When trust in consequence collapses, compliance follows. The law stops functioning as a boundary and starts resembling guidance. That is a dangerous transition, and it rarely announces itself. It simply becomes normal. Attempts to compensate through legislation targeting specific weapons have produced predictable results. Markets adapt, terminology shifts, enforcement lags. Meanwhile, the underlying drivers remain untouched. Violence is not caused by blade shapes, it is caused by the uncertainty of impunity. When that certainty spreads, escalation is inevitable. Last night's unrest exposed that fragility brutally. It showed what happens when enforcement is constrained by optics, custody by capacity, and policy by fear of controversy. The system bends, then yields, not dramatically but incrementally, until the public notices the bend is permanent. Critically, this does not only affect high crime areas, it radiates outward. Businesses reconsider locations, residents alter routines, parents calculate risks previously unthinkable. These are not emotional reactions, they are rational responses to perceived vulnerability. Once that perception sets in, restoring confidence becomes exponentially harder than maintaining it ever was. Authority then must prove itself repeatedly, under scrutiny, without error. That is a tall order for a system already stretched thin. And while officials debate language, the public has already drawn conclusions. The most telling development is not the unrest itself, but the behavioral shift it accelerates. Communities are no longer waiting passively. Informal patrols are forming quietly. Defensive measures are being sourced privately. Parents are adapting logistics around perceived danger. None of this is coordinated, and that is precisely the concern. When individuals begin solving security problems independently, coherence fractures. This marks the unraveling of an unspoken agreement that the state holds a monopoly on protection. Once that belief dissolves, restoring it requires more than messaging. It requires visible, sustained enforcement and credible consequences. Without that, reassurance sounds hollow. The danger now lies in normalization. When scenes that would once have shocked instead confirm expectations, the baseline has shifted. That shift is subtle but profound. It alters how people vote, how they move, and how they trust. It also alters how future unrest unfolds. Each incident lowers the threshold for the next. Officials may argue this is cyclical. The public increasingly believes it is structural. That distinction matters. Cycles can be managed. Structural failures demand reform. Denying that reality only widens the gap between narrative and experience. Last night did not invent a crisis, it illuminated one. The streets did not erupt spontaneously, they responded logically to conditions long in place. Until those conditions change, repetition is not just possible, it is probable. The question now is not whether calm will return temporarily, it likely will. The question is whether confidence will. And confidence, once lost, does not respond to press statements, it responds to outcomes. That is the reckoning left behind when the smoke clears. If you want updates that prioritize clarity over comfort, follow this channel, engage with the discussion, share perspectives responsibly, and stay informed beyond the headlines. This story is evolving, and silence serves no one.